fortitude, temperance, prudence, and justice. These cardinal virtues were once the bedrock of Western civilization. As each has been eroded or altogether supplanted and replaced by the very vices they were meant to combat, the West is now at a crossroads. Many see the coming collapse and seek to infuse these virtues, once held by our forebears, by means foreign to the very civilizations that enshrined them. Christians, seeing that the pagans once held them, seek to be rid of them for fear of corruption. But in our pursuit of fidelity, have we in turn sacrificed the most powerful vehicle of their propagation? By removing the valor and might of the heroes of old, have we in turn renounced the cultural birthright of the West? Today I sit down with Dr. Louis Markos as we discuss the importance and power of the pagan myths, how we as Christians can mine them for the virtues which God has woven into His creation, and how to protect ourselves from the tendency to syncretize the Christian faith with pagan myth and miss the truth in the process. The West may fail, but if we are to keep it, we must recover one of the most powerful tools given to us by the one who is the true myth. This is The Myth Made Fact with Dr. Louis Markos. Welcome to the Sword and Staff Revenant. I'm your host, Coleman Barber. I'm one of the elders at Proclaim Church in Bonner Springs, Kansas, and joining me today is Dr. Louis Markos. Dr. Markos is a professor at Houston Christian University, where he teaches a lot of things, including courses in C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, which we're all a big fan of here. Also mythology and epic, which we are also big fans of here. He's also published several books related to his expertise, including Myth Made Fact, which I have right here. My wife doesn't believe in dust covers, which is a shame because this is got a great dust cover for those who enjoy the aesthetics of it. So, but that's going to be our topic of the episode today. So, Lou, right?
Yep.
I've given a brief introduction here, but I'll let you introduce yourself to everybody else.
Thanks for having me on, Coleman. Looking forward to some good conversation. You can tell your wife I agree with her. Dust covers are the stupidest thing in the world. But you're right. It does have that beautiful Daedalus and Icarus. I like it when there's not a dust cover, but the picture is actually on the book. You know, and that's still a pretty attractive title. And actually, Classic Academic Press went all out on this book. It gets so well illustrated. It's just beautiful stuff.
Agreed.
So anyway, I am actually a Yankee. I grew up in New Jersey. I went to Colgate University, undergrad, University of Michigan for master's and PhD, studied the Romantics and the Victorians. But I have been down here teaching at Houston Christian University, used to be Houston Baptist, now Houston Christian for 34 years, Coleman. I've been here since 1991, keeping myself busy. I'm glad to say that HCU is a university that believes in bringing Athens and Jerusalem together. What that means is taking our Greco-Roman heritage and our Judeo-Christian heritage and bringing them together. And that's kind of what I'm all about. I published a book called From Achilles to Christ, From Plato to Christ. The Myth Made Fact next year is going to be From Aristotle to Christ. So I really believe that as Christians, we can actually learn much of value from the pre-Christian Greek and Roman pagan writers, what Dante called the virtuous pagans, right? Homer and Virgil and Plato and Aristotle and Cicero. And that undergirds a lot of what I do. And it's something that was agreed upon by people like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien that I also write a lot about. So we are trying to, while being centered on the special revelation of the Bible and Christ, and that is our touchstone, we believe that we can learn a lot from general revelation, the way God speaks to all people. I'm sure that'll come out as we go. But like I said, glad to be on, Coleman.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate you being here, and that kind of effort of recovering those links and actually gleaning what we can. I think plundering the Egyptians is something that a lot of people use as a term. Really stands out in this book. So first, I want to talk about it generally, and then we can get into some specifics. But can you give folks like the Myth Made Fact elevator pitch?
So what I do in this book is I take 50 myths from Greek mythology, from Greek tragedy, from Greek epic. It's all drawn together. And in each chapter, you could almost read it devotionally if you wanted, because I begin each chapter by retelling the myth in my own words, like I'm a storyteller, trying to dramatize it, make it exciting, right? Any of us can just go on Google now and find out the basic plot of Daedalus and Icarus. But I'm trying to get back to the old storyteller and do it. And in fact, if any of your listeners have Audible, I actually did the audio version. I've never done a full
cool.
audio version. It took a lot of time, but they let me be dramatic and all that stuff. So first retelling it, then I have the Christian reading of it. What can this teach Christians, not only about the gospel, but about living in a moral way, about the challenges and temptations of the world, all of these life lessons that I think we can learn. And Coleman, every so often I'll hear a preacher use a sermon illustration from Greek tragedy, and that's good, but sometimes they only use it as an illustration. I do believe that we can gather real wisdom from it. The wisdom must be tested against the touchstone of Scripture. But I believe that there is a source of knowledge. And I'll just tell you, just because you mentioned plunder the Egyptians, what a lot of people don't realize is part of that same story is when Moses comes back from the mountain and he's got all the Jews with him, and he goes to see his father-in-law, Jethro, who is a pagan, a Gentile, right? We might call him a virtuous pagan. And he says, Moses, are you trying to be judge for all of these people? That's not very efficient, my son-in-law. You're going to exhaust yourself. Why don't? And he basically gives him a lesson on what we would call the delegation of power. And Moses accepts the good, practical advice from his non-Jewish Gentile father-in-law. So that's just another example. So, but anyway, I do a reading, and then I've got lots and lots of notes with historical and biographical background. And then there is, every chapter has a very long series of questions for every age. This is a book you can use with third graders or sixth graders, high school, college, church reading group. I try to have every age possible there. And there's lots of questions that are open-ended questions to lead book studies and Bible studies and dig you into it. And again, the whole point is, wow, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, but he's also the Savior of the world. And as I like to put it, Jesus not only fulfills the Old Testament law and prophets, he fulfills the highest yearnings of the pagan peoples. And so I see Christ, the desire of the ages, as he's often called, the Lord and Savior of all the nations. He also stands at the apex of all the highest desires, many of which are recorded in mythology.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's a great elevator pitch too. When I was first reading through the book, and you get into some of these things in like the preface and the introduction and pieces, but until you're actually reading, the different stories in the book, it's kind of hard to categorize it, and you don't totally know what you're getting into.
Right.
And I was kind of like, well, it's not just a storybook. It's not a textbook. It's not really a nonfiction topical book in any way, shape, or form. And the term that came up to my mind, and you kind of already said this, is I thought of it as a Western mythology devotional.
Oh, nice. And I mean it to be kind of, imagine if, what's his name? Who's the one that wrote the Book of Virtues? William Bennett. When he wrote the Book of Virtue, imagine if after every story he retold, he gave a sort of full Christian analysis and questions and all. Because now, of course, he's borrowing from both non-Christian and Christian sources. But we've forgotten. And in fact, what's funny about that great book is that if it had been published 100 years ago, people would have said, well, duh. Okay, but because we've forgotten that the number one way humanity has taught virtue and passed it down to their children was through stories, especially myths, this almost becomes like, oh, I never thought of that. It's like somebody saying, oh, I just reinvented liturgy. Isn't that wonderful? Sort of stuff, I'm at a Reformed Baptist, and, we do, I'll bet your church does that. The word of the Lord. thanks be to God, right? It's like,
Indeed.
oh, we don't like those Catholics, but hey, look at this liturgy. Isn't this fun? Anyway, so we need to be brought back into that. So the point is, again, we hear these stories, and actually, Coleman, it was even more important for me to write this book when I did, because I'm very angry at the way they're taking our fairy tales and our myths and making them politically correct. And that's grotesque. Even Shrek, which is a very funny movie, but it has a lot to answer for, leading to things like Maleficent and everything else and whatnot. And again, do not steal our stories, because that is the way that the tradition has been passed down. It's one of the things that made Rome great. It made our founding fathers great, because they passed those stories down and they learned from them. And again, there's something about it when you embody or incarnate it in a myth or story that makes it stick. And we really need to go back to those virtues, because all we're given today are politically correct woke values, and they're destroying our children. So we need to get back to the real virtues.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things you say early on in the book as well is, your purpose in this is to put sort of a positive pedagogical option out there for us to get back to these great stories. Because a lot of people, you're right, they don't know the stories. And I say this as like kind of a recovering, like modern / postmodern Christian environment person, right? So, we don't know the mythology. And so what do? We go to Google, we read a Wikipedia article, we get all of the facts of the myth, but we don't really get the vehicle there.
Right. Oh, that's the right word. Very good.
And, we've kind of lost that, and we've sort of like taught people to function that way through public education and things like that. And you said at the beginning of your book, you're like, I could rail all day on these things, but I'm not going to, because what we're actually going to do is try and put a positive foot forward and do some different things. So we classically homeschool our kids through classical conversations. We've got a lot of folks who do that in our church, and various other things too. So,
because it's very easy to just spend all day making fun of phony values like diversity, equity, inclusion, multiculturalism, environmental. You can go on forever, and that's kind of fun. But it gets to a point where we have to lay down the negative defensive approach and get the positive offensive approach. Not offensive, but offensive, because the best way to pull children away from these phony pseudo values is to reignite the virtues, to make them so appealing and wonderful and beautiful that people won't even be attracted to the values. They'll be attracted to the virtues, and then they will be a beacon, so that these poor kids who know nothing about virtue will be attracted to something in these young people and find it attractive again. So yes, we've been on the defensive too long. We need to go forward and reclaim our tradition. I mean, man, when we surrendered the arts to the secular people, it's crazy. Where did the best art come from Christian artists? And so it's about time. You know the story about, what's his name, General Booth of the Salvation Army. The story was that he was listening to one of his brass bands, and they were playing a song. And he said, I recognize the words, but that tune, it's so beautiful. Where did it come from? And the poor guy had to, embarrassedly say, well, it's actually a drinking song. And apparently he said, darn it, why should the devil have all the best tunes? And so it's like, let's go. And apparently the Star Spangled Banner was a bar song. I don't know who could drink that. That's hard enough to sing sober, right? But anyway, it's like we're just like, I don't know if you're in church, but I remember when all these evangelicals started having praise dancing at their church. Like, oh my gosh, right? But it's about time that we reclaim all of the arts for God. Right? And someone says, oh, what about pornography? Well, pornography is not an art. Pornography is a perversion of the art of the classical nude. Okay, so there are things that are already perverted, but the background to it, these things come from the hand of God. Remember, Satan can't create anything. All he can do is take what God has created and pervert it, twist it, get us to use it in the wrong way, the wrong time with the wrong person, etc. But the arts themselves, and even all the virtues and even all the pleasures, come from God, right? So we know what Augustine, sin is privation. Sin disfigures, it does not create.
Yeah, that's good. Well, moving into the book a little bit here, and a lot of the things are actually today we're going to talk about are kind of from like the beginnings and the ends, because I actually want people to read the middle part, right? I want people to look at the myths, and I want them to actually digest the things the way that you have them put there. But kind of setting up the reasons why you're doing all those things, and then the resources. By the way, the back of this book has an incredible appendix. If you say, hey, these are really good stories, but I'd like to hear the originals, you can find out where to find them very easily. Right. So they're in the back of the book.
That's true. And every time I tell one of the 50 myths, I put at the end the original, the best telling, whether it's by Ovid or Homer or Hesiod, whatever. I put it there in case you want to look up the best telling that most influenced me and tells it the best.
Which is a huge resource, by the way, because there are lots of versions of these old things, and not all of them are created equal.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm reminded, and this is not a myth, but my first experience with The City of God by Augustine, I purchased a version of it, just completely blind, kind of randomly. I was young, but I knew that I should read it. And they don't even capitalize God in it and things. And I was like, oh, this is like a completely secular version of like somebody who really didn't like Augustine must have actually, translated this. But anyways, that's not the point. I'm going to read a quote here and then get some feedback from you or ask you a question. So you say the Enlightenment privileging of fact over value or reason over imagination has convinced large numbers of Christians, particularly my fellow Reformed and evangelical Protestants, this is true, by the way, to focus heavily on systematic theology and logic-based apologetics while shying away from those more aesthetic, imagination-based aspects of the faith that resist rigorous analysis. By so doing, they have cut themselves off from what I would boldly call the ministry of myth. So my question out of there is, what is the ministry of myth? And what does that actually look like?
Let me step back and tell a story that I tell somewhere in the beginning of the book, and it's a true story. 10 or 15 years ago, I was told that there was a radio evangelist who was telling people, don't read C.S. Lewis, right? And he was in Florida. My parents live in Florida. So I sat down and talked with him. And as I expected, he'd not read anything by C.S. Lewis. He just read something online. That didn't faze me. What fazed me is when I said to him, by the way, this is a very strong believing Christian. He's since passed away, led a lot of people to faith, so I don't want to make fun of him. This is just what's out there. And so I remember saying to him, well, sir, what have you read by C.S. Lewis? Have you read the Chronicles of Narnia? And he said, ever since I became a believer 40 years ago, I have not read a single work of fiction. He didn't even read the Left Behind series, which is probably a good thing, Coleman.
Hey, folks. Just wanted to say thank you again for listening to the podcast. I hope you're enjoying this conversation with Dr. Louis Markos. If you're enjoying this conversation, good news. We're planning on getting together again and talking about a new book that he has coming out. So stay tuned for that. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, then you can do that in a couple of ways. First, if you're enjoying this, share it with people. Like, subscribe, interact with the podcast in whatever platforms that you're listening to it or watching it on. That really helps us out in the algorithms. You can always head over to the merch store and pick up a coffee mug. If you're interested in joining the Church Bell Renaissance after listening to our episode on music, sound, and spiritual warfare, you can get a shirt there as well. And there's also affiliate links in the description. So if you're interested in reading The Myth Made Fact by Louis Markos that we're talking about today, there will be a link to that in the description, and you can pick that up. We get a little bit of a kickback, or if you haven't done it yet, go ahead and give us a 5-star review. Thanks, everyone. Now back to the conversation.
Ever since I became a believer 40 years ago, I have not read a single work of fiction. He didn't even read the Left Behind series, which is probably a good thing, Coleman. But anyway, so what are you talking about? Now, it took me a long time. Now, if I was a young whippersnapper, I would have said to him, you do realize that the parables of Jesus are fictional short stories. But I wasn't there to make fun of the man. I went home and I thought about it and prayed about it, and I realized something. The light bulb went off, burned all my hair off, right? The light bulb went off. So if you ask this man, why don't you read fiction? He would have said, because I'm a Christian. But I believe the real reason he doesn't read fiction, the reason he doesn't know, is that he's a modernist and he doesn't know it. He doesn't realize that he's accepted, as most of us have, this enlightenment split that says This is fact and this is value. This is reason and this is imagination. Logic and intuition, history and myth, science and religion, etc., etc., etc. This is an artificial division that's only about 300 years old. But we've bought it so much, okay? We can even be guilty. I believe the Bible is the Word of God. It has a lot to tell us about science, right? But it's not a science textbook. And when we treat it like a science textbook, we're going to end up losing, because why are we going to make the Bible something it never intended to be? It tells us the truth about God's origin of the world, but we have so bought into this. It's got to be, quote, scientific logic, even when we say the Bible is inerrant and it has no contradictions. Well, if you mean it has no contradictions in terms of truth, I agree with you. But if you mean no contradictions in a modern, logical, positivistic, mathematical sense, then it does have contradictions. Not anything that takes away from authority, but only if you're looking at it as a modern book, rather than looking at it as what it is. The Gospels are 4 different Gospels based on eyewitness accounts that complement each other. Don't exactly word for word repeat each other. That would be a kind of a collusion, right? So we have got to free our minds and understand that the Bible, well, we're supposed to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. I would add imagination. I think we can sneak that in there. That God wants the full person, and God speaks to us. Why do you think Jesus speaks in parables? Why doesn't he just give us, logical, step-by-step, systematic proofs? He speaks in parables that he makes up. There wasn't really a man with 2 sons, right? Now, all of us want to make the story of Lazarus and the rich man historically accurate because we want some information about the afterlife, but that's probably made up as well if you compare it with all the other ones. I mean, it does have the name Lazarus. That makes it kind of unique from all the other parables. That is an actual name. But the point is that God speaks to us through our mind, but he also speaks through the heart, through the reason, but also through the imagination, through the logic, but also through the intuition. And the ministry of myth is to take these ideas and incarnate them, give them flesh and bones, right? How many Christians for the last 300 years have been really moved by the Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, right? There's an allegory of the Christian life, but by incarnating the temptations that we face during the Christian walk, it makes it more real and tangible, and we can wrestle with it more. We all wrestle with despair at some point in our Christian walk, but when he speaks of the giant despair who locks us up in the dungeon of despair and doubting castle, then we start to understand it, and then we realize that he has got the key of promise and can leave anytime he wants. You see how that allegory, that story, brings it to life. But what's unique about the myth is that the myth, I don't remember who first said this, but when one person alone has a dream, we call it a dream. But when a whole civilization, or at least a whole tribe, dreams together, we get a myth. A myth is pointing to the desires, the fears, the yearnings of a civilization that is taken and sort of put in that myth, but not in a mechanical way, in an organic way in which it sprung up as a myth. And so the ministry of myth is to get us to use the full person that God has given us, so that we not only learn the lesson, but we imbibe the lesson, we absorb it in a way. Coleman, a lot of preachers these days have pointed out how God more often, even Jesus, more often says listen than he says see. Isn't that interesting? We have eyes and we don't see, ears but we don't hear. But Jesus says more often, let those who have ears hear, because through the ears comes the full story. It's not just the visual that often gets very reductive. It's the full hearing and wrestling with that God seems, concerned with.
No, that's good. You were mentioning Pilgrim's Progress, and I was just reminded of a personal experience that I had with that, which is interesting because Pilgrim's Progress, for anybody who's read it, it's not particularly clever. It's very, very on the nose about everything.
Yes.
And part of that is kind of wonderful, but just the way that he captures the reality of the Christian life, even in these very on the nose allegories that aren't. I mean, it is beautifully told when you take it as a whole, but I mean, it's very, very, very on the nose. But there's this scene a little bit later in the book where, man, it's been several years now since I read it last, but he's essentially fighting against spiritual attack.
Good.
And, the enemy's coming after him. And just the way that he captures that feeling of despair. It doesn't matter what you struggle with, whatever sin is your besetting sin as a Christian. I think it's actually better for not pointing a specific one out, because everybody is going to be hit and gripped by that passage because of just the deep despair that every Christian who has ever dealt with any sort of besetting sin, which is all of us.
That might be the scene with Apollyon, you're thinking.
Yes, that's it.
He uses the full armor of God to protect him, the shield of faith, etc. And you're right. It is. It also helps for us to realize that yes, our struggles are not a strange thing that doesn't happen to people.
Yes,
right. Such as is common to all men, but God provides the way of escape. Right. But like I said, it's. I mean, what greater metaphor than life is a road? Because we are all pilgrims on the road. That's why we gravitate towards something like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings or Narnia, where everybody's continually walking. Walk. Oh my gosh, when you read Lord of the Rings, there's endless marches. You might as well be in World War I. And of course, don't plug World War I. Just what do you do in the infantry? You march, and you just keep marching, but you continue on. You don't give up. You don't surrender. You keep moving down the road, because we are sojourners, pilgrims, strangers in a strange land. The image that comes up in the Bible again and again, especially the Old Testament, but it's also in Acts and other places as well.
Yeah, that's great. Well, back to this ministry of myth. I think that this book is largely a part of your endeavor to do that, right? So we have a really mixed group of listeners on this podcast. So we've got, I would say there's a majority that are Christian, but Christians of many various stripes, right? We come in lots of different shapes and sizes and colors and flavors, systematic theologies, as we talked about earlier. But we also have a lot of folks that are various brands of what I would generically term pagan, right? So anything that's not that, if you're listening and you fall into something that's not that, and I offended you because you're like an earnest pagan proper, then I apologize. Kind of. Come to Christ.
It's the pagans that were most readily converted to Christ, as C.S. Lewis reminds us.
Right. So in that, we've got this mixed group of perspectives. You actually had to go through the process of translating to say, okay, how do I uncover the virtue? How do I uncover what's good and true and beautiful out of these pagan myths? Because that's what they are. And do that without crossing any lines. So like, how do you draw that bright line of not mixing and becoming syncretistic, while also readily and heartily feasting on what is good?
Wow. I don't know if you've ever read a book by Don Richardson. He was a missionary in Papua New Guinea. He wrote a book called The Peace Child. It was very famous. That's his autobiography. But he also wrote a book called Eternity in Their Hearts. And he gave me a very, very helpful method for distinguishing, and he calls it the Melchizedek factor and the Sodom factor. And this is Genesis, what is it, about 10, 12, when Abraham goes in and he saves Lot because Sodom and Gomorrah have been overrun. And afterwards, this strange man who's the king of Jerusalem, the king of Salem, the king of peace, named Melchizedek, comes and speaks to him. And he says that he is a worshiper of El Elyon, which means God Most High. Now, this is not a Hebrew name, right? But Abraham accepts the name and uses it, El Elyon. He finds that there is an actual truth in this, a real bridge. He also mentions that many of the missionaries in China were very successful because they adopted the name Shang-Ti, which basically means God of the heavens, basically. But he says, none of the early Christians use the name Yahweh Zeus, because that's too corrupting. And so right after Melchizedek, the leader of Sodom wants to give some money and supplies to Abraham. And he says, no, I will take nothing from you, nothing at all, because that would have been the syncretistic thing. And that's why, again, never did the early church adopt Zeus or any of that. But they did adopt logos and theos, the Greek word for word and for God, because somehow they were not corrupted, right? If I went to India, I might find a similar yearning in the Hindu soul that I could point to as a bridge to Christ. But I would not say, oh, Jesus is the 10th avataram of the god Vishnu. You see, that's syncretistic. That is what gets God very, very mad in the Bible. So as opposed to just saying, oh, like the Baha'i faith, all religions are what? Not that at all. It is, let us try to discern what is the deeper and proper yearning and make that connection and build that bridge and build on that. As Jesus speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4, he does not say your desires are wrong. Her desire is for love, for acceptance, for intimacy. But he does say you're going about it in a very wrong, self-destructive way. 5 husbands are now living with a man who's not your husband. But Jesus clearly recognizes what her real need is. If you asked me, I would give you living water that would be inside of you like a well welling up to eternal life. So that's where the discernment is. You are looking for a deeper yearning or desire rather than saying, oh, it's all the same thing with a different name. That's always the danger of syncretism. Extreme versions of liberalism fall into that as well. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about discerning. Look, I don't know if it's ever bothered you, but are you telling me that until the coming of Christ, God ignored 99% of the human race? Oh, only to the Jews did he speak directly, special revelation, the Bible, the prophets. But he didn't ignore. The rest of the world got general revelation, also known as common grace. He spoke to them, right, in the reaping and the sowing, and gave rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. He did speak through the major avenues of general revelation as detailed in Romans. Romans chapter 1, they are without excuse, for God's power and holiness is seen in creation. So God speaks through nature or through creation. And the Gentile, Romans 2, the Gentiles who are without the law are a law unto themselves, their conscience now affirming, now condemning. Again, so 2, creation, conscience, but also God speaks through reason. God speaks through imagination. He reaches out to us in a multitude of ways. He only spoke perfectly in his son, but he did speak. I mean, gosh, he spoke through Balaam, the pagan prophet, right? He spoke wisdom through that. He raised up Cyrus, the Persian king who did not know Yahweh, and yet used him to bring the Jews back. He used Alexander the Great to unite the world, give it the common language, what we call Koine, or common Greek, which is what the New Testament was written in, and the Old Testament was translated into in the Septuagint. So God, he used Nebuchadnezzar, right? I mean, so God can use these people. And again, we have to be discerning. We can't just accept anything, right? But as always, right? Sometimes it's a satanic deception. We do have to be careful. But I think that's the minority. Let's not give too much credit to Satan.
He's not as good as we made him out to be.
That's right. He is. We do have to be careful, right? I talk about this a lot, that when you read Paradise Lost, book 1 and 2, the Babylonian, Egyptian, Philistine gods are super evil. But the Greek gods, he depicts them as living in the sort of cold middle air. Somehow not as directly evil as those. And look, it's clear that the Romans are the good pagans compared to the Carthaginians, or the Greeks compared to the Persians. I mean, you can see that when you're reading. We still have to be careful, right? But God, as G.K. Chesterton says in The Everlasting Man, God used the good pagans, the Romans, to defeat the Carthaginians, who are the Phoenicians, who the Jews were supposed to wipe out but failed to do. So God raised up the good pagans to do this. So again, we have to be careful, but it's there. I remember there's a scene, and Origen likes to talk about it, somewhere in the law that says, you want to, you're a Jew and you fall in love with a Gentile woman. Can you have her as his wife? Well, first she has to reject everything. You like shave off her hair and cut it off, and then you reconsecrate her for
Right.
the Lord. Just like in Bede's, what is it, the Venerable Bede, Ecclesiastical History, some of the early British Christians were able to take an old temple, they desacralized it, and then they reconsecrated it for the Lord. For a while, the Parthenon was used as a church in Athens. Did you know that? So that's pretty wild stuff. So there is precedent for this
Yeah.
throughout the Bible and church history. But again, let us be careful. Let us not mix them together, and some people do that. Let's not say I'm a Druid for Christ. That's a little bit far, my friend.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
But maybe there's something in the Christmas tree that speaks of our yearning in the midst of winter for spring that does point to the death and resurrection of Christ.
Yeah.
If you have eyes to see and ears to hear.
Yeah. No, and that. I think you're right, and it's a good warning. And I think that folks that are sort of, well, we have kind of probably two groups of listeners. I think most of our listeners would fall within like a kind of a divine counsel or a Deuteronomy 32 worldview. That there is something real. We don't have a full picture, but there's something real behind the pagan gods and the pagan myths and things like that. And
maybe even the heroes. It says, the Nephilim were the men of renown.
Right.
Is that Achilles? Is that Hercules? Is that Hector? It certainly seems to be Goliath.
Yep.
He's pretty clearly seems to be a Nephilim, a descendant of the Nephilim. What is it that Hamlet says? There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, right? There is a spiritual dimension. And one of the things I love about Michael Heiser is he suggests, whether he's right or not, but he suggests that one of the reasons why the prophecies of Christ's death and resurrection are so riddling in the Old Testament is so that the stupid demons wouldn't figure it out. They were dumb enough to actually allow Christ to be crucified. That's when the serpent bit the heel, allowing the foot to crush the head. And I don't know if he's absolutely right about that, but that's a fascinating reading of it. Also, whether he's right or not, all Christians struggle with the idea of the conquest of Canaan. But it's very possible that all the places that God ordered to be put under the ban and completely destroyed were places that still had Nephilim, with the last Nephilim being Goliath. Yeah. Possible. Again, it's hard to say we don't have enough evidence, but I think there's a good case to be made for that. And I think a helpful one.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Caleb is the boss. Caleb is the old man that I want to be. Going in at 80s, like there's still work to do. Give me the Lamb with the Giants. So it's one of my favorite stories ever. So, but yeah, so, when we're talking about these, like, how do we keep from the syncretism? I think our folks would be really concerned about that because, one of the things that I'm sure you've encountered with people is if you look at Arabic translations of scripture, they will often use the name Allah for God, right? And so if you hold like a divine counsel worldview, then that's a really dangerous proposition because are you doing what you're suggesting to do here, which is you're taking the good redeemable concept, right? The baptizable name and idea and attributing that to God, or have you taken it a step too far? And I don't know the answer on that one specifically, but
that's an interesting one because Allah ultimately is just their generic name for God, like our name for God. But you're right that in that case it can cause confusion. Just give a simple example. We have got to stop using the word gender and use the proper word sex. We just keep falling right into this.
Yep.
But when I complain about the growing gender confusion, if I said the growing sexual confusion, that would probably be misunderstood, Coleman, if you think about it. In that case, I really can't say sexual confusion it'll confuse people. So I'll say gender confusion. And it's kind of hard. I don't like the fact we say I'm having a gender reveal party, but I'm having a sex reveal party. That might be misunderstood. So I mean, there are times we have to take the context and be careful about what we're doing. But yes, there are phony substitutes out there that we have to be careful about. What does Paul say? If even an angel of light appears to you and preaches a gospel different than mine, don't listen to it. I mean, we do have to be careful, because it does say Satan appears as an angel of light. So we have to be careful with what we're doing. I still don't know fully what to make about the whole "he gets us." That was, remember, he gets us during the Super Bowl. It seemed to me like it's a good example of planting seeds to get people lead to the gospel, but I've heard other people make, I think, cogent arguments that, no, it's watering down the gospel. I think that's a tough one. We have to be careful. But there are times when it's just a clear syncretism that we have to be careful that we don't fall into and allow us to use our compassion and be fooled by people who are actually using our compassion for their own political ends. We do have to be careful, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Well, relating this idea, you use the term to describe these myths that you have in this book particularly, but the people who wrote these things down originally, or recorded them, however those things were passed on, use this term proto-Christian, right? Which some people might have a little, question on. But you use that, and you define it as pagan writers whose works God often used as a bridge from paganism to Christianity. So, like I had mentioned earlier, the traditional Christian response to these writers has been to take the plunder the Egyptians approach, to take what's good, learn from the virtues they uncover. But, and I have an opinion on this, but I want to get your opinion. Do you think we're starting to see a new rise in that kind of person today? Like contemporaries that would be like our very own version of that kind of proto-Christian?
Well, yeah. His name is Jordan Peterson. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly who I thought.
And wonder of wonders, insanity of insanity, Joe Rogan.
Hey, folks. I wanted to give a shout out to our new friends over at Patriarch Cigars. They're a Reformed Christian, family-owned company who aim to glorify God and expand His kingdom through the work of their hands. This is not a paid spot or anything, but we met through the Reformed podcast bracket, and they were kind enough to send a few cigars this way. You can go to patriarchcigars.com and pick some up and support them. I'm excited to try mine out this weekend. Links in the show notes.
Wonder of wonders, insanity of insanity, Joe Rogan? Maybe that's a little
right.
But what the heck? Russell Brand. I've listened to him, and it seems clear to me that his conversion is sincere. He says some pretty deep theological things, but is also clearly open to learn and be, told differently. So I think that's a sincere thing. I mean, now Bill Maher, I still don't trust him, but he actually says things that are like intelligent. Crazy. He's like the most immature of all the atheists out there. Well, maybe Richard Dawkins, but even Richard Dawkins is saying, I'm a cultural Christian. Well, okay, I'm still not going to learn anything from him, but he's going to remind us that the things that even the liberal progressives like is actually a gift of Christianity. I mean, the better treatment of women, the equal dignity, that comes from Christianity. Where else do you think that comes from? But I mean, Jordan Peterson, I wrote an essay about him recently, and I started by saying, I don't think there's anybody in the world that Christians are praying for more right now than Jordan Peterson, right? His wife joined the Catholic Church back in the spring. His daughter is an evangelical, and he is moving. And lately, he said something like, I believe Jesus is God. We're trying to figure out what he meant. But Jordan Peterson is actually a good answer for two reasons, because Jordan Peterson is the other one who mines the myths for all their meaning. Now, at this point, he still doesn't accept Genesis as historical, but what he has to say, particularly about Cain and Abel, is so true to help us understand the danger of envy and jealousy and covetousness. And everybody kind of forgets that you shall not kill, steal, lie. What's the other one? Commit adultery. That those are all obviously active sins, but coveting. How do I hurt you if I'm coveting your wife? Isn't that isn't that a victimless crime?
Mm.
But hey, let's go back to the first murder. It was done because of an extreme covetousness and envy. So everything he says about it, a lot of stuff he says about Moses, a lot of stuff he says about Abraham, there's a lot of wisdom in it because he understands the meaning of the story. It may still be almost only mythic and not historical, Tim, but he recognizes that there's truth there. Coleman, don't you love when you get these secular people who try to come up with a, quote, scientific explanation for the parting of the Red Sea? Hey, buddy, if you don't believe it, why don't you throw out the whole story? It doesn't, it's like a joke. But obviously, here's a person who recognizes the authority of this story, that it has a meaning that transcends. But I can't handle that, so I'm going to come up with a scientific. But again, they don't throw out the story. And as long as they're reading the story, God's word does not come back void, right, Coleman? Mm-hmm. He will speak through his word. And I'm part of a Bible study that meets once a week where Christians and Muslims, we get together, we read the Bible, the Quran, we talk, right? Why should I be afraid of that? If I believe the Bible is the word of God, it will speak for itself. Now, again, I'm very careful in the way I explain things and whatnot, but let us, again, God saves people in the craziest ways, in the most unlikely of ways, right? A donkey talks to you. What's that all about? Going back to Balaam. Although I don't know if Balaam actually became a believer, but he certainly was used by God. Whether or not he became a believer in the end, it's like Simon Magus. I don't know if he came back or not. But God, look, going back to Don Richardson, he says, if you look at these ancient cultures, you will find what he called redemptive analogies. I'm sorry. I wrote a book called Plato to Christ because I am a man of the West. I want a Christian from China to write from Buddha to Christ. Or from Confucius to Christ. Because I think if you look, this is how I like to put it. I can't remember if I said it in this book or my other book, that Christianity is not the only truth, but it is the only complete truth. What do I mean by that? By saying, if I say Christianity is the only truth, it's like I'm dropping a wall and everything outside of Christianity is 100% lie. Well, that's not the way the world works. Folks, there are bits and pieces of truth in every culture, every religion, because we're made in the image of God. And even though we're fallen, we did not lose the image of God. For God has written eternity in the hearts of men. So there are bits and pieces of truth, but only in only in Christ do we get truth in its absolute and perfect form. And I grew up in the 1970s, Coleman, the most pathetic decade in the history of our country. I grew up in the 1970s, and everybody liked to say, well, truth is at the top of the hill, and there are many ways around. And I said, I agree with you, but the truth that's at the top of the hill is the guy who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And there are many ways around that. Think of the Magi. Think of all the crazy, wonderful testimonies of people throughout the years who have come to Christ in the most crazy of ways, but that's how God works. And we need to look for the traces of wisdom that are there, because they may not always have the answers, Coleman, the pagans, but they often ask the questions in a way that needs to be asked so that we can wrestle with them.
Yeah, that's great. I think Jordan Peterson, back to him, I think he's a great example. It's interesting to me, you're talking about how he kind of gets this, like, what's the purpose of the story? And I think that's what myths do really well. And I think what a lot of the pagans, to their credit, they do really well is they're a little less concerned about this, like, hard, truth, reality, fact sort of distinction that we were talking that you brought out earlier, that fact value distinction. And sometimes I think we as Christians, for all of the wonderful work that they have done, I think somewhere like, and I'm not picking on them, this is great work, but somewhere like Answers in Genesis, they tend to be like, okay, how can we utilize all of the factual tools to try and prove that the Bible's right? And they do a good job, right? Some people don't do a good job with that, but sometimes we miss the point, right? That's actually us. Like you were talking about earlier with the gentleman who had never read fiction since he became a Christian. Right. Oh, that's not because you're a Christian. That's because you're a modernist. That's because you're indoctrinated in the Enlightenment.
but without realizing it. A
Yes.
good example of it, how many Christians do you talk to that are absolutely convinced that the reason God forbade pork and shellfish is because they have a lot of diseases and he wanted to keep them healthy?
That's
Now,
right.
that may be the case. I'm not throwing that out, but it's our modern idea that God wouldn't ask you to do something unless he had a good scientific health reason for it, right? And it just shows our mindset. It's still hard for us not to imagine heaven as individual mansions, right? I don't want heaven to be like a dorm room, but it might be. I don't know. But we've got. Look, let me give you a good example of this slipperiness that I love. Remember the prophecy in Isaiah: the virgin shall conceive and give birth to a child, and you shall call him Emmanuel. All right, there was a lot of debate amongst evangelicals, and many of them getting very liberal. It's like, well, that Hebrew word should really be translated young girl rather than virgin.
Yes.
Well, guess what? You just found a redemptive slipperiness. Because yes, in Hebrew, that word can mean virgin or young girl. But the Greek word parthena can only mean virgin. Okay. Now, why is that important? Because Isaiah's prophecy, like so many prophecies in the Old Testament, is a double prophecy. It was fulfilled very quickly when Isaiah's wife, a young woman, gave birth to a child. But the full revelation, the full fulfillment won't be until 700 years later when Christ is born to a literal virgin or parthena. If it wasn't for the slipperiness of the Hebrew language, and Hebrew is a poetic language with a smaller vocabulary, with lots of layers of meaning, whereas Greek is a more exact, like Latin, a more exact kind of language. And so God knew what he was doing in speaking all those prophecies and psalms in the more, a lot of people compare Hebrew to Old English, a more naturally poetic language. So there it is. I call that redemptive slipperiness, right?
Yeah. I like
Wonderful.
that.
Dan Brown didn't understand that the great riddle book that he yearns for in the Da Vinci Code is called the Bible. Is there any better riddle book? Isaiah 53 says that he will be, what is it? He will be amongst the sinners, but with a rich man in his death. What the heck does that mean? It's a contradiction. But Jesus was crucified between two thieves or criminals, but he was buried in the tomb of a rich man named Joseph of Arimathea. So, I mean, that's a kind of riddle that will not be solved until we get to Christ. And there are a lot of riddles in the pagans as well. If we have ears to hear, we will see them, right? Pandora's box. What is this story about a woman that gets too curious and opens up a box and lets out all the evils, but then in the bottom of the box is hope? Oh my gosh. Is that look, let me end with this because I think this will help. Okay.
Yeah.
If you go to a secular school and you take social studies, you might even get this in a Christian school. You take social and you read the great epic of Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh has a great flood story. And if you have your regular, sixth grade teacher, she'll say to you, now children, we now know that every ancient culture has a story of a global flood. And that's true. Not just the Mesopotamia, but the Aborigines, the Chinese, the Native American Indians over here. They all have stories of global floods. And children, that just proves that the Bible is a myth. And I thought, there's another way to read that. There's another way to read those facts. If every culture around the world has a story of a global flood, that says to me that there was a global flood. Why else? Whereas in every other culture, it maintains only its mythic value. In the Bible, because of the inspiration of God through Moses, we get the historical account. I don't mind that there are mythic elements to it. Myth doesn't mean a lie, right? Myth means a story that explains why things are the way they are, about origins and destinations and things. Both C.S. Lewis and Chesterton and Tolkien all refer to Christianity as a true myth. The gospel is a true myth. It's a myth because it tells a story of life, death, and resurrection. But it also happens to be true and historical, whereas the other ones aren't, right? As Lewis reminds us, Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate. It's all in order. It doesn't take place in some la-la land like it does in mythology and the archetypes. It takes place in a real time and place with real consequences.
Yeah.
So it's true, but it doesn't lose its mythic power.
Yeah.
Being true. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah. Well, and like you were talking about with the global flood, even the modern day is starting to come around to that with guys like, I don't know if you followed the ancient apocalypse with Graham
Oh
Hancock
yeah.
on Netflix, and back to Joe Rogan. Like Joe Rogan's like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
there was a global flood, that sort of
But
thing.
it's just really funny. I love. I mean, I like the Jungians. Jordan Peterson is a
Yeah.
Jungian, right? And the Jungians say the reason for these archetypes is the collective unconscious.
Mm.
Well, what do you think it came from? What do you think you come up with a word that explains things? Where did it come from that we all have these archetypes stored inside of us? That doesn't just happen by evolution. That's kind of ridiculous, right? So, I mean, you probably know this, Coleman. The phrase meta-narrative that folks like you and I love, that was invented by the secular postmodern people to tell us that there is no meta-narrative. But guess what? We're going to go ahead and use your thing because there actually is a meta. The anthropic principle that says everything, the fine-tuning of our earth, all points towards the creation of man. Well, the person who invented the phrase anthropic principle was an atheist, right? Who said it just seems, but no, it is. I mean, there's so many things like that that were actually, the Big Bang was itself coined by a non-believer. But we're like, okay, we'll use it. We'll use it. I mean, it's like you see the truth, but you won't accept the ramifications of it. The great Stephen Hawking, in his early life, did all of he could to explain and popularize the Big Bang. And then he spent the second half of his life trying to tell us that all the theistic implications of the Big Bang are just poppycock. So really, he spent his whole life doing that? It's just sort of sad. We come so far, and then the accountability is too close. And we hide, like we all do. Even as Christians, we hide behind parts of the Bible we don't like, right? And so, again, we need to be troubled back into wisdom. Listen to the old stories again. What is it about treading the old paths? Remember that in the Bible somewhere? The ancient roads, treading the ancient roads. Maybe we'll learn something again.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, on that note, people should, and a great place to start is this book. And I think that you've done a really great work. I'm excited to see. I'd love to see other people as well, like you said, in some other traditions and other cultures do similar things. You noted that for some of these older and more like ancient Near Eastern sort of myths and things, there might be even a little bit more danger in some of those as well. But
some of them, yeah. I mean, Norse mythology has a lot of amazing stories as well. The idea of Balder, the dying god, is also important. But again, we just come to look. There are certain things I don't do. Okay, I read all this stuff, but I would never use a Ouija board or attend a seance, Coleman.
Yep.
Even though I'm a strong Christian, I wouldn't do, because the devil has power too. You do it, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So I would never mess with that stuff. But there's a difference, and I don't even mess with runes and stuff. Anything that is too much, because God is not, doesn't like fortune telling and all that sort of stuff. He's pretty strong against it. So I'm very careful with that. But let me end with this distinction. I think it's a helpful distinction. I make it in the book: black magic and white magic. Black magic is about power. You need to be careful. People that actually get into Satanism are looking for power and domination, and they end up becoming just flat and destroyed. The white magic is what's looking for sympathy and synthesis, a lost kind of connection. There, I think there's more. We still have to be careful, obviously, but that's what we see. That's why people are attracted to the Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia. Yeah. It's a deeper kind of magic. I'll end, I keep saying this, but I will end with this. In Lord of the Rings, they have invisibility cloaks, and a lot of people misunderstand. They think it's like Harry Potter, and invisibility. It's not a magic cloak. It doesn't have technical power. It is because the elves have woven into the cloaks the lore of stone and wood and tree and mountain, and therefore they are like chameleons, and they bring you into sympathy with nature and hide you. And they did a very good job in the movie when they're by that sort of rocky asphalt, and they're covered because again, literally like a chameleon is what it is, which is, one of God's great creations and mysteries, and also one of God's great jokes, really, because God does laugh, I think. So think about it that way. That's the kind of magic. And there's no greater magic than God becomes man but still stays God. There's no greater magic than the incarnation. So as I teach my kids, The world is full of magic. You just have to have eyes to see it and ears to hear it. So, folks, go to my Amazon page. That's the easiest way. Louis Markos, Markos, and all my books are on there. And that's probably the best way to find the different books I have. And if you go to YouTube and type in my name, I've got a lot of speeches that for free you can watch. Some of them I'm wearing a mask from COVID, but whatever. I've got some up there as well. So anyway.
Great. Well, thanks, Lou, for coming on the program. And thanks for telling everybody where you can find all your different stuff. If you're all interested in anything from us, from Sword and Staff, then we've got links in the description. We've got a Discord. You'd be more than welcome to join and, hit everybody with your knowledge. But we have a Discord that's linked there. I also do have the book linked there as well. So if you're interested in that, it is an Amazon affiliate link, so I'll get like a little kickback, but it doesn't cost anybody anything extra. And then if you want to get a mug with a bust of Plato with a tinfoil hat on it, we have that too.
Hey, so, there we go.
And that's linked down there also. But thanks again for being on, and thanks for listening, everybody. Stay tethered.